Buonasera, vi leggerò velocemente una piccola biografia di Jan Gehl, che è l'ultimo ospite della giornata. Jan Gehl, nato in Danimarca nel 1936, architetto, professore e consulente di progettazione urbana, ha incentrato la sua carriera sul miglioramento della qualità della vita urbana, riorientando la progettazione della città verso le persone che le abitano, vita pubblica, pedoni e ciclisti. I suoi libri includono gli ormai classici Life Between Buildings and Sittings for People, pubblicati in oltre 40 lingue. Tra i principali progetti di miglioramento delle città realizzati da Gehl Architects figurano Copenaghen, Melbourne, Sydney, Londra e New York. Jan Gehl è stato insignito del premio Sir Patrick Abercrombie per i contributi esemplari all'urbanistica da parte dell'Unione Internazionale Architetti, della chiave della città di Sydney e delle lauree honoris causa a Edimburgo, Toronto, Varna e Halifax, ed è socio onorario degli istituti di architettura di Danimarca, Regno Unito, Stati Uniti, Canada, Scozia e Irlanda, nonché degli istituti di pianificazione di Australia e Irlanda. Io ho avuto l'occasione chiaramente di studiare sui suoi libri come questo, Vita in città, che credo conosciamo tutti. Ho avuto l'occasione di incontrarlo lo scorso anno a Copenaghen al Congresso internazionale degli architetti, e quindi per me è assolutamente un onore e un piacere presentarlo a voi stasera. Mi sento un po', credo come tutti voi, come un bambino in un negozio di caramelle, perché non è facile avere qualcuno di così importante tra noi. So, please, Jan, if you join us on the stage. Thank you to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I take the floor and I keep it. But I realize that you are soon going to have dinner, and I shall try to respect that fact that you are thinking of dinner, all of you. I went to a conference in England, and there was this architecture critic, Ken Warpole. He took up an object, and he said, "Do you think this is architecture?" No, it's not architecture. It's sculpture. Architecture, it's only if it can interact with life. So good architecture is form interacting well with life. But the problem in our profession is that we've studied form so very much and life so very little. So we need a better balance between life and form to make good architecture. That's what I will address today. And I've been asked to concentrate on how we can learn from Italy to make better cities for people in the 21st century. Let's start here. I graduated 64 years ago in Copenhagen. I was trained in the 50s, and what did we learn in the 50s? Very carefully, we learned to be good modernists. We learned that the important thing when you do a city is that you should hang 5 kilometers up in the air, and then you should move the objects around. Bingo, this is a good city. Here is a situation. One of our professors was very famous because he said a good housing area is something which looks great from the autostrada. And here he has made a project in Sweden which looks good from the autostrada. Maybe it's not good for people, but that's another story. We didn't learn about that in School of Architecture in the 50s. We were modernists. And I went out of School of Architecture as a good modernist to do all these wonderful things which will give people a better life. Then I married a psychologist. And At once, we had a lot of psychologists in the house, and they all asked us young architects, why are you not interested in people? Why don't they teach you anything about people in School of Architecture? Why do your professors go out 4 o'clock in the morning and take photos of the monuments so they're not disturbing people in front of the monuments? Have you thought about that? And we said that the important thing is actually aesthetics and architecture. And they say aesthetics and architecture is this much, and there's so much more about people which you have not learned about. So I was sitting there. Actually, also in School of Architecture, we learned that the form has no influence on the quality of life, because people would be so happy to have a new flat in one of these things which looks good from an aeroplane, that they will be happy and live a wonderful life forever. They had running water, what more could you ask for? And they had view to some grass. My wife and I, we were sitting there in Copenhagen, and we were looking out to what they were doing, the architects were doing in the suburbs of Copenhagen. They were doing blocks, as we learned in modernism to do. And also at the same time, the cities were completely overrun by automobiles. And actually we realized that we in the 20th century, before 1960 or around 1960, it really broke out. There were 2 new planning diagrams which were absolutely dominating and completely destructing the old way of building. We had the modernism and we had the car invasion. And then, of course, we thought about, come on now, the good old days. There were many nice places all over the world. All was made before modernism in the good old days. And it was interesting that buildings, that cities in all parts of the world looked more or less the same. They were in human scale, and they were very much meant for a walking animal, Homo sapiens. And they looked very much the same because they were made by people, for people, and they worked very well under those circumstances, and everybody loved that sort of good old days. If you analyze the old cities more closely, you'll find that in the old days, like in Perugia, old part, the city is a series of spaces where life can go on, spaces for people. The cities were made of spaces for people and spaces for life, and they worked very well for life and for people. That was in the good old days. And if you look at an old city, this is Copenhagen. In Copenhagen, we can remember all the streets and all the squares, but only 3 buildings, the King's Castle and the Parliament and the Dome. All the rest are streets and squares. So a few monuments stands out, all the rest is buildings which are forming spaces. We know that spaces were what made cities earlier on. The Nolli map of Rome is one continuous series of spaces, and this is Rome. There's not a single building, sort of, monument, but you show here what is made, what is available for people, what are the public spaces and public accessible spaces. All cities were made of spaces for life and for people. All this came to a very abrupt end with the Athens Charter of 1933. It was not made by the European Union or by United Nations. They never existed. It was made by some very strong architects, Corbusier, one of them, and they said all the old stuff must go. Now we have modern man. We don't have Homo sapiens anymore. We have modern man. They didn't talk much about modern woman, but modern man. And always you must separate, put living here, put work here, put recreation here and communication. Never put it together. And then also, of course, they introduce the idea that we need mobility to go from this to that to that. Then suddenly it was not the spaces which made the cities, but the objects. And what was not built upon was not spaces for people, but leftover space after the objects had got in. And that, of course, made good room for mobility. And if you go to any of the new cities now, you can find no spaces at all because there are none. There are only objects, and they get more and more funny, these objects. And I think it looks very much like a place for perfume for women or for men, that everybody tried to look more interesting than everybody else. That's some of the things we saw, my wife and I, way back, or saw the beginnings of. We also realized that modernism was an end of concern for people in the cities and for the social life in the public spaces. There were no spaces anymore, and there were nowhere where life could go on, sort of. Also, modernism was the end of knowledge of human scale. Instead of moving in human scale spaces for people, we started to move around in leftover spaces after building objects. And that's a completely different story. And gradually, all of us forgot about what is human scale. And ever since modernism, we have been very confused as architects or planners about what is good human space. At the same time, there was, of course, we needed mobility to move from here to there, but the automobile industry was ready to provide. It didn't do much before the Second World War, but after Second World War, we had the car invasion all over the developing countries, and the key word for everybody was mobility, 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 and we used more time in parliaments and city councils to talk about how we could make more mobility and should we have more cars and more freeways and autostrada and more lanes in the roads, whatever. With the car, they at once started to invade every space in every city in the places where they started to introduce the cars. And with the cars also came a new confusion about human scale. In the good old days, we had 5 km/h scale, a scale made for people, made for walking, small spaces, human scale. You could easily see small signs, you could see people, you could hear the voices of people. You can just go down here in Perugia in the streets and hear all this human scale, 5 km/h architecture. With the automobile, we started to have everything in 60 km/h architecture, huge spaces, and huge signs. You cannot see small signs when you are moving in 50 km or 60 km. You cannot see details, so don't do details. You cannot see people anymore. So we got used to this completely other scale where we used to have the 5 km/h scale. When we go on holiday, we most of the time go to 5 km/h places. We don't like really to spend much time in 60 km scale. All this happened in the 60s, and that was exactly when I graduated into this confusion. And what was known about quality for people in 1960? Virtually nothing. It was generally thought that whatever you built didn't matter at all, because the only thing which mattered was that it was a nice pattern seen from an aeroplane, and it was nice proportions in your block buildings. Then, of course, and also everything was filled with cars. Then, of course, started a counter movement. People started to think about, is this really what is best for people? Is this really what we want? Modernism and motorism. And we heard the first voice from America. The famous Jane Jacobs wrote her book about that if the modernists and the motorists were going to make the cities of the future, it will be the end of great American cities and the start of dead American cities. She did a fantastic work with her book and also to prevent freeways from crisscrossing Manhattan. So she really started to raise the banner. She didn't talk much about Italy, but she talked about the experience from America. In England, in 1961, Gordon Cullen was lamenting about the townscape which we have lost. The guy over there, he was trying to picture his old cities while he looked at the modernist city, and he said, go and look at the old stuff in Oxford. Other guys, they said, learn from Las Vegas, Venturi, Scott Brown, and Igenor. And very quickly we realized maybe you shouldn't learn much from Las Vegas. Much more interesting was to look a little bit back in history to Camillo Sitte, who actually in Vienna in 1889, he wrote a very famous book, City Planning According to Artistic Principles. It was the birth of urban design. He was criticizing the very technocratic way they did streets and squares in the second part of the 19th century. And he went to Italy, and he went from one city to the other and said, look how carefully they placed the monument, how carefully they spaced the squares, how they always made sure that there were interesting intersections and nice views. They looked upon the city as a piece of art. That has been forgotten. Now we shall try to learn from Italy, because you can see everything down there. There I was sitting in Copenhagen with my wife, and we were worried about the future of architecture, and we thought, where can we learn about what did public life mean in cities, and what's the importance of human scale? Where can we learn about this human scale and public life? Maybe we should go to Italy, because in Italy there was really many different cities, and there were really many cities from the good old days. So my wife and I decided, we got some money from Carlsberg Brewery for half a year in Italy, so we used the beer money to drink Chianti on the Italian squares. So we decided to go to Italy and try to find out about what were the public spaces used for, what was public life, and what was the relation between form and life. And then we found, very interestingly, that in all the literature about Italian squares, there were hardly a word about what was going on in the squares. There was something about parades and religious ceremonies, but what was the daily day like? We could find nothing. In painters, you could find signs of life, and also in authors of, like Hans Christian Andersen, long description of life in Italian squares, but not in the architecture and art history. We found nothing. But we decided to go to not many cities, but a few, and make some detours. We went to Lucca, to Ascoli Piceno, and Martina Franca. Lucca and Ascoli Piceno are both old Roman cities. You can recognize the very regular pattern in the center, but they were developed further and still in good human scale. And then the last one, Martina Franca, was like Venice, but without canals. It was self-grown, really made by people for people. And we went to these places, and it was me who did most of the things, because we had a little child with us, and of course, Mama was looking after mostly. I talked to my wife, but I did the observations, and the methods I used, was sitting there from early morning to late night and watching what was going on and making endless many notes about Of course, they thought in Ascoli that I was a beatnik, but then they found out I was a researcher and architect. They were very surprised. And then we sat there, and what we watched in '65 was the life of Italy at that time on a very, very extraordinary, well-dimensioned and crafted square, the Piazza del Popolo in Ascoli, and we looked at the day life. There was a little tendency that mostly were men who was using the place, but the women we found on the other days in the market. We looked at the passeggiata and the traditions of the city, that when a person died, he was always carried across the square before he was put to rest in the graveyard, because he had to say goodbye to the city. There was the evening passeggiata, and it's very interesting to go there today to see that you can see just about the same phenomena, but not so strong at all. Of course, we also noticed that in Ascoli and other places, there were places which were full of people every day, and there were places where there were not a soul any day. And then we thought, what was the difference between why do the people go there and don't go there? And we started to make all this put it in order, and trying to find patterns and trying to find some of the things we found really was about the character of life in public spaces. If you think that the major thing is walking, you're wrong. We found it was much more important, much more interesting was the people who was not walking. Why were they stopping, and where were they stopping? And why did we love the place to stop so much? So it's not about having many people walking, but having many places which invite people to linger, to stop, whatever. And we also saw the framework of all the social activities which are related to being on foot in a city. It was in Ascoli I started to study what I call the edge effect, that because all our senses are out here, we normally go out to the edge of a space where we are not in the way and where we can start to see everything going on without being prominent. That, of course, we found, as years go by, we have found this edge effect everywhere. You can find it in the St. Peter's Square in Rome, in the little square in Barcelona. Actually, you can find it all over the world because it belongs to the human body and the fact that we have our senses here, and it's natural to go out to the fringe if you're not very active. So we found that as a general pattern of Homo sapiens worldwide. And then we started to think maybe the architects are different from ordinary people. And then we started a very serious series of studies of how architecture students behaved in various countries. And we found all over the place that architects were behaving exactly like ordinary people. And then we started to wonder, who put up this sort of thing? Who designed this? And who did they expect to come and sit there? We didn't know that many silly places around the world really have been made. In this case, we know exactly it was Danish Libeskind who did this. Nobody will use them to sit on, but skaters are not invited either, so they're just there. If you do this kind of thing, then make sure to have some bronze people, or the thing will never be used. But if you have some bronze people, there will be some. That's good. We also found some other we found that something which we can call urban friends. We also call it the piano effect, because when you're at a reception, you drift around, and then when you see the piano, you go over and stand next to the piano. Then you have a friend if you don't know anybody. In Siena, we started to notice that bollards were very useful as friends. This lady is not alone, she has a friend. It's a little quiet friend, but she has a friend. The man has a friend. And you can put the garbage over to the friend. That's better. And we found that if you took all the bollards away in Siena, there will be no life in Siena because all the friends would be gone. Because on a good day, it was just as important, just as impossible to find an empty bollard in Siena as to find a parking space in New York. So we could see this pattern that edge is fine, niches are fine, objects in the public space are also useful. In Siena, they use these wonderful bollards. In Guatemala, they have little columns to small girls. In Warsaw, they have big columns for big girls. We found that even monks and nuns do it with bollards. We found also in Australia, there are no standing anytime. But that's exactly where you stand because you have a friend. And the city furniture is not so beautiful in Australia, but the pattern is the same. When we came home from Italy, we published in 3-4 issues of Danish Architectural Magazine our studies, and there was great commotion, and some people said it's the first time in the history of architectural magazines that human needs and human behavior and all this is really being treated in depth and told about. And that got very much attention. I was at once advised to come down to the School of Architecture again. So I had to go back to School of Architecture for 40 more years to study more about, to make more people more visible. And of course, the first thing I asked about, why didn't you tell me anything about people first time I was in School of Architecture? Then I realized they didn't know a thing. So we had to start from the very bottom and start to find out. And there I was sitting for 40 years and watching how people used public spaces and architecture. And then I started to put some of these things together in books, like this one, Life Between Buildings. It's more than 50 years old now. It's come out all over the world. And I'm very, very, very proud that in many developing countries, they have a solid interest in the life between the buildings and not only in the buildings. Other books I did over the years, like this one, which was 40 years later and was more the same subject, but with 40 more years of research. And this is out now in, I think it's 39 languages, which of course makes you very humble and proud. And also I'm very proud that 3 of my books are out in Italian, which is very, very comforting and nice. I saw some of them out there even. But of course it's impressive, but 6 of my books are out in Chinese. That's really something which makes an old guy very, very proud and happy. But then I realized they had not had time to read them over there. But maybe when time comes, they will be reading the books about cities for people. Some of what enormously much have been found out about the relationship between cities and people and life and buildings and life and people. I'll just sum up some of the things. We learned in my school days that form has nothing to do with quality of life. That is completely wrong. We make the cities and then the cities make us and form us and give us the conditions for our quality of life. We make the buildings and then the buildings have an enormous influence about how our daily day is, how we will have it when we are old, how our children will play. A lot of things will depend on what kind of architecture you make and what kind of life do you invite for. And we also, of course, made lists of all the things you can do to prevent people from going to a place. And some architects are very good in finding out how to overlook all the quality criteria. But also we have found that if you look carefully at the quality criteria, you could have all the year 10 times more people in the same space, type of space, with the same number of people coming by every day. There will be 10 times more people settling down and having a good time. In the top square, the people will gallop out of the square to get away as fast as possible. In the other one, they'll come from all over the city to sit there and have a good time. It's a fantastic difference. We can control that. So looking back at 50 or 60 years of research in this people, life, architecture, business, we will be able to say that if you want to make cities for people, find cities for people, we know now how to do. We have enough knowledge. The problem is that it's not used very widely yet, but it's better and better. I have come to realize that by making all these books and all this research, you can change the mindset of many architecture students and many architects, many politicians and many citizens across the world. And they start to see, yeah, maybe life is important, maybe we can do more for that. And that change of mindset is very important. That is not about what it looks like from the Autostrada, but it's like how it is inviting people. So the mindset must be changed. But then when you have changed the mindset, then you can start, of course, changing the cities. And I have experienced, of course, that when we started to produce all these books, we had all these mayors starting to come and say, you can criticize what we are doing, but couldn't you come and show us personally what we shall do? And that was the start of the second part of my career after teaching and researching. Then I started to be consultant to cities, and it's been many cities by now. And all of them started to say, we are different. We are more related to the motor car than any other place in the world. The worst was in New York. They say, we are the big apple. You can never use European ideas here. That will be just a joke. We are awake 24 hours a day. They couldn't remember who said that later on. But we worked with many cities. I have had this fantastic opportunity to work with a number of cities. I could tell you about Copenhagen, and I will in a moment's time. But I'll tell you some of the other stories very quickly because you have to go to dinner. Melbourne, in 1985, they started to be worried in Melbourne. It looked like any city in the New World, and it was just as boring as Kansas City. Very bad. They had an empty and useless city center. They called the city the donut, something with nothing in the middle. And in the weekend, there were not a single person in the city center. In the evening, it was completely deserted. They decided to revitalize the city. And they did an enormous amount of good things to make it a vital city. And they have become very, very successful. I have been following and advising them since the early 90s. And by now, Melbourne has definitely a character like Paris, but the weather is much better. So Melbourne is by far the best city in the southern hemisphere, and if you don't know what to do, go move to Melbourne. It's a good idea. It's a nice city, nice weather, and they've done enormously much. This was one of the first I worked with. Later on, there were others. One of them was this one. That is Bloomberg in New York, presenting his plan for New York. Now we shall walk and use metro and bicycle in New York. And then it should be the most climate-friendly metropole in the world. And they were not very good in New York. Sidewalks were absolutely unpleasant to walk on. They were too small. There were no benches. There were no sidewalk cafes. it was not a very nice city. If you were tired, you could go up to Central Park, 4 kilometers that way, and rest up there. But it was not a people-friendly city. The bicyclists were protecting the parked cars and not having a good time. Shortly after they started with this plan, the mayors from New York, the mayor of planning and transport, they came rushing over to Copenhagen to hear something about what experience we had in Copenhagen. And in the end, they said, we want a city like this one. When can you come? And then I was very quick. I said, we can come on Monday. And then we rushed over to New York, and that was the beginning of a very interesting work with the city of New York, where maybe the most famous thing was that we were able to close Broadway to traffic. Actually, they figured out they didn't need traffic in Broadway. It would be much easier to drive in New York if they didn't have Broadway. And there would be fewer accidents, everything. So we were able to create a number of public spaces where Broadway crossed the avenues. Of course, most famously in Times Square, but also in Herald Square and in Madison Square and Union Square. So, and now they've become so happy about taking asphalt from the cars that they made 50 new public spaces in a city where they had almost none. And then we can start to sing, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere, New York, New York. And they were very surprised that it worked so well, and it did work very well. In Sydney, I worked quite a bit. Sydney is very famous for its waterfront, and it is not very famous for what is behind the waterfront. It was really bad. And it was really hard work because the buses belonged to the state of New South Wales and the street belongs to the city. The city wanted a nice street and the state wanted to keep their buses. So we had to work very hard for a long period to get the cars and the buses out of Main Street. But now, success. Now Main Street, Sydney, 2.5 kilometers, has become cleared of traffic, of buses. There's a light rail going up there, and it's a completely new story. They have learned from Italy the glory of being able to walk freely in the city. It's become a very nice city, Sydney, actually. Also, in smaller cities and in other cultures, I've had the joy to apply learning from Italy to other settings, like here in Jordan, in Amman, in this area for Palestinian refugees, where they had nowhere to go, and we realized that we could make a lovely public space in this particular area. Also, in many other places, I've seen that they've taken up knowledge from Italy, like in Bogota, where the mayor cleared the sidewalks and made bicycle lanes and made a much nicer city and put in public transportation. Enrique Peñalosa, I have nothing to do with that except writing the books which inspired them, I was told. Then we come to Copenhagen. It will be a very brief story because your dinner is 8 minutes away. Copenhagen was one of the very first to start to pedestrianize. That was in '62. That was 1 year after Jane Jacobs started to raise the banner in New York. And it was very, very early that the politicians dared to take the traffic out of Main Street, Copenhagen, 1 kilometer long. They did it to make it better for the businesses, not to make it better for people, but to businesses. But they took the cars out, and there was a big cry, it will never work, it's too cold in Denmark. We are Danes, we are not Italians, it will never work up here. And they did it anyway. Next year we started to be Italians, and we have become more and more Italians ever since '62, and that's 62 years ago. And Copenhagen was completely swamped with cars as any other city in Europe, but now it's been made to people places. All the squares have been cleared of parked cars, and many of the streets are now the last cars will be going out of downtown. And they've seen a fantastic conversion in Copenhagen. It's become a very livable city. One reason for that is that we in the School of Architecture had started in Italy this tradition of counting the people, on recording where they were, what they were doing, what they liked, what they did not like, and publish it. So we have the saying in America, what you count, you care for. In every city in Europe, they counted all the traffic and cared for traffic. And the traffic engineers came and said, we need extra lanes, Mr. Mayor. You can see the figures here. But now in Copenhagen, we had also data about the public, and we saw that the better we made the city, the more public life there were. And then they were much more interested in improving it for the people than improving the city for the cars, because we were the first city in the world where systematically the life of the city was recorded and published regularly. We did it at the Royal School of Architecture, and so that was a cooperation between university and city. And because Denmark is small, then they knew everything about what we did in School of Architecture, and we knew the mayor and all the guys in the city council and on the city planning office. That was all our old students, whatever. So there was a close cooperation. In the end, the city paid all our studies. So we proved in Copenhagen that the more space you left for public life and walking and sitting and whatever, the more people came. And it was completely convincing that every time you made 14 square meters, there was another guy coming. And Copenhagen was very inspired by this, and they have been going on and going on and going on and making more and more people spaces in the city of Copenhagen, not only in the old city, but all over the city, because now they have two strategies. We will be the best city in the world for people, and we also will be the best city in the world for bicycles. They started especially after the oil crisis in 1973, to do a lot for the bicycles. They now have bicycle lanes all over the city, very good ones for all generations. I came to realize maybe we shall not talk about putting bicycle lanes into Perugia, because it's a little bit hilly, I realize. But all the other places, like New York, are very flat, very good. In Copenhagen, we have seen that the more which was done for bicycles, the more bicyclists came out and the more they used the city. And in Copenhagen, for the first city in the world, we could prove that if you, instead of inviting more traffic by making more streets and lanes, you invited more walking, more bicycling, and more public life by looking after the people, then you will have more of that. And that was quite important, that we now have documentation that if the invitations here will work as the invitations for the motor car worked for 60 years. What happened in a city like Copenhagen when you do all these awful things to parking spaces and to lanes, whatever? Yeah, this Minister of Culture picks up some really good literature, and then she suggests a new architecture policy, put people first in architecture. What happens when you do all this? Yeah, we have more than 400 delegations of mayors coming every year to hear from our politicians what they shall do in their own city. What happens when you do all these bad things in dramatic changes to traffic and whatever in a city like Copenhagen? You become the most livable city in the world, one year after the other, in the list of Monocle, in the list of the economic. So you see a clear pattern that being kind to people also means that the city has a very good image, and the city of Copenhagen has a very fine image as a people-friendly city. What happens when you do all these bad things to a city? They may put your face on the metro doors and say, we are grateful for what you have done for our city and in my lifetime. That's very unique, and I was very proud of that. But ending the story now, every generation of architects have gone to Italy to make studies. They do it every single year. My personal favorite has been to study what a city without cars can do for life in a city. So I've studied much in Venice. But just before I went down here, I saw in my present School of Architecture, I've been employed again many years after I was thrown out because of age in another school. I've now become a professor again in this one, and I saw that they were busily learning from Siena in the school. I thought, oh, that's a good path they have taken here. And then they went last year on a study tour, and they sent me this photo that you sat there 60 years ago. Now we are all sitting there and continued, because studying people and knowing about people is very important. Knowing about what is human scale, what does people use public spaces for, how does the form influence the life of a city and architecture. This is very important, and this generation after generation have gone to Italy to learn, because you have all this wonderful heritage you have not ruined yet, and you have also a nice climate, and you have Chianti. So it's a good place to study. So I will say to everybody, if you want human scale and care for people, you can do a lot of studies in Italy, which can inspire you worldwide to make more humanistic city planning and better cities for people. So learn from Italy, but be quick before the mass tourism ruins everything. Thank you very much.